The photograph had survived wars, fires, and a century of neglect, its edges softened by time and its surface clouded with dust. Taken in 1899, it showed a young boy standing beside his sister, their small hands clasped together in what appeared to be a simple, tender gesture. He looked straight into the camera, expression calm, almost protective. She leaned slightly toward him, her face blurred just enough to suggest shyness or movement. To anyone who glanced at it, the image felt comforting. An echo of childhood, of family bonds untouched by cruelty. For decades, the photograph was catalogued and forgotten, resurfacing occasionally in collections that celebrated early portrait photography. Viewers lingered on the innocence of it, on the quiet humanity captured in a time when photographs were rare and moments were precious. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Nothing demanded a second look, until the restoration began. High-resolution scans peeled back the damage layer by layer, removing scratches, correcting exposure, sharpening details that had been softened by age. As the image clarified, the warmth people remembered began to drain away. The boy's hand was not resting gently in his sister's grasp. It was wrapped tight, the fingers pressing in too deeply, the tension unmistakable. His expression, once read as calm, now appeared rigid, controlled in a way no child's face should be. And then there was the shadow. It sat where no shadow should have been, cutting across the ground at an angle that defied the light source of the studio. It wasn't cast by the children, nor by any visible object in the frame. It seemed to belong to something just outside the photograph, something the camera had not meant to capture. As technicians adjusted contrast and depth, another detail emerged, one so subtle it had remained invisible for over 100 years. At that moment, the photograph stopped being a relic of the past. It became a warning, frozen in time, waiting for someone to finally see it. The photograph was discovered deep within a regional archive, tucked between brittle ledgers and mislabeled envelopes that had not been touched in decades. Its paper was thick, textured, and faintly yellowed, the kind produced in an era when photographs were meant to endure, not circulate. The handwritten date on the back, 1899, was still legible, though the ink had faded into a soft brown. At first glance, nothing about it seemed remarkable. It showed a young boy and his sister standing side by side, their hands joined, framed carefully as though the photographer had taken special care to preserve a moment of familial tenderness. Archivists initially responded to it with mild appreciation rather than curiosity. Images like this were common from the turn of the century, children dressed in their best clothes, posed stiffly in studios or outdoor courtyards, their expressions shaped by the long exposure times required by early cameras. The boy's posture appeared upright and composed, his gaze steady and confident. His sister stood close, slightly turned toward him, her free hand resting against her dress. The composition suggested protection, an older sibling watching over a younger one, a visual story that resonated instantly with those who viewed it. When the image was catalogued, it was described in simple, affectionate terms. Notes were added referencing the apparent bond between the children, highlighting the emotional weight of their clasped hands. Over time, the photograph was occasionally selected for exhibitions, celebrating domestic life in the late 19th century. Visitors paused before it, often longer than they did with other portraits, drawn in by the quiet intimacy it seemed to offer. Some remarked on how modern it felt, how easily the moment could belong to any era, despite the old-fashioned clothing and rigid posing. The image began to develop a subtle reputation within the archive's collection. It was frequently chosen for brochures, academic presentations, and educational materials meant to humanize history. Teachers used it to illustrate childhood at the dawn of a new century, and historians referenced it as an example of how photography captured emotional narratives long before candid images became common. The photograph's appeal lay in its simplicity. It asked nothing of the viewer except recognition of a universal bond. As years passed, the story surrounding the image grew more polished, more certain. The boy was assumed to be the older sibling, the protector, the anchor in a world that was often harsh to children. The sister was seen as fragile, reliant, comforted by his presence. No one questioned these assumptions, because the photograph seemed to confirm them. It offered a moment of sweetness that felt rare and precious, amid the harsher realities of the time, and so it was accepted without resistance, preserved as a quiet symbol of innocence frozen in a fading square of paper. The decision to restore the photograph was made for practical reasons rather than suspicion. Fine cracks had begun to spread across the surface, and the image was losing contrast at a pace that alarmed preservation staff. A digital restoration was approved to ensure the photograph could be archived properly for future generations. The process began routinely, with high-resolution scanning designed to capture every fiber of the paper and every grain of the original print. At this stage, the image still appeared much as it always had, familiar and unthreatening. As the restoration specialist worked through the early stages, minor inconsistencies began to appear. These were not dramatic flaws, but small irregularities that disrupted the expected harmony of the composition. The boy's posture, when isolated from the rest of the image and analyzed more closely, seemed unnaturally rigid. His shoulders were set too square, his stance too deliberate for a child of his apparent age. What had once been read as composure now suggested restraint, as though he were holding himself in place rather than simply standing still. Attention then shifted to the children's hands. When the area was enlarged, the grip between them appeared tighter than originally assumed. The boy's fingers pressed inward, leaving slight indentations in his sister's skin that would not have been visible without digital enhancement. The angle of his wrist was subtly twisted, creating tension in the joint that contradicted the idea of a gentle, reassuring hold. The sister's hand, by contrast, showed no reciprocal pressure, her fingers resting limply, as though they were being held rather than holding back. Lighting analysis further complicated the initial interpretation. Early photographic studios relied heavily on controlled light sources, and shadows were typically predictable. Yet the shading around the boy's arm fell in a way that suggested strain, emphasizing muscle definition unusual for a child. The restoration software highlighted these areas automatically, revealing details that the human eye had previously smoothed over. Each enhancement seemed to strip away another layer of comfort from the image. The specialist paused repeatedly, comparing the restored sections with the original scan, searching for errors in the process. But the data remained consistent. Nothing had been added, nothing had been altered beyond clarity. What emerged was not a different photograph, but a more honest one. The boy's expression, once softened by blur, now appeared fixed and intent, his gaze focused not outward, but inward, as if concentrating on maintaining control. What unsettled the restoration team most was the realization that these details had always been there. Time had not created them, it had merely concealed them. The photograph had told the same story for over a century, but only in fragments. Now, as those fragments aligned, the image began to resist the narrative imposed upon it, quietly insisting that what appeared protective might have been something far more deliberate and far less innocent. As the restoration progressed beyond structural clarity and into deeper enhancement, the photograph began to fracture its own narrative. The most disturbing change did not announce itself immediately. It surfaced gradually as layers of contrast and depth were adjusted. What first appeared as a simple darkened area near the children's feet sharpened into a defined shadow, one that did not align with the lighting geometry of the studio. Its angle suggested a presence positioned closer to the children than the camera, yet no physical form accompanied it within the frame. Technicians initially assumed an artifact of damage or a flaw introduced during scanning. They cross-checked the shadow against the original print, the negative and earlier reproductions. It was present in all of them, faint but consistent, ignored only because it blended too easily into the background. When isolated digitally, its edges appeared unnaturally crisp, compared to the softer shadows cast by the children. The light source indicated by the boy's face and clothing should have produced shadows falling away from the center. Yet this one cut inward, as though cast by something standing between the children and the light. Further enhancement revealed another detail that collapsed the photograph's perceived innocence. Beneath the boy's sleeve, near the wrist that gripped his sister's hand, faint discoloration became visible. It was not damage to the print, nor staining from age. The tonal variation followed the contours of skin beneath fabric, consistent with bruising. The marks were subtle, almost polite in their restraint, but unmistakable once seen. They suggested repetition rather than accident, pressure applied more than once, long enough to leave memory in flesh. The sister's figure, previously softened by blur, also yielded new information. Her posture leaned not toward her brother, but slightly away, her shoulder angled back as if resisting a pull. The tilt of her head, once interpreted as shyness, now resembled withdrawal, when facial reconstruction tools clarified her expression. Her mouth appeared tense, lips pressed together in a line too deliberate for a child posing casually. Her eyes, barely visible before, were directed not at the camera, but downward, focused on the point where their hands met. Together, these revelations dismantled the story that had been told for generations. The photograph no longer depicted a protective bond frozen in time. It suggested a moment of containment, of control disguised as care. The longer analysts studied it, the more the image seemed to recoil from observation, as though the act of being seen was an intrusion it had avoided for over a century. What had once been celebrated as a symbol of familial love now stood exposed as a carefully framed lie, preserved not by intention, but by collective misinterpretation and silence once doubt had been introduced. The photograph could no longer exist in isolation. Archivists and historians began tracing its origins, searching for any documentation that might contextualize the children beyond the frame. The studio's records were fragmentary, but a ledger from the same year listed a family surname that matched a faint inscription on the back of the print. From there, census documents, church registries, and municipal records were pulled, each offering small, unsettling fragments of a larger story that had never been assembled before. The household appeared briefly, and then disappeared from official records in a way that raised immediate concern. The parents were listed together in earlier census entries, but within a few years, only the boy's name remained, marked as head of household despite his young age. The sister's name surfaced sporadically in church attendance logs, always without consistent age progression, as though time did not move for her in the same way it did for others. Several years later, her name vanished entirely, with no death certificate, marriage record, or relocation notice to explain the absence. Local newspapers from the period provided further hints, though never clarity. Short articles referenced disturbances reported in the same district where the family lived, complaints of shouting heard late at night, and concerns raised by neighbors about the well-being of children behind closed doors. None of these reports named individuals directly, but the dates and addresses overlapped too precisely to be coincidence. One brief column mentioned an investigation that was quietly dropped due to lack of evidence and community pressure. Its language careful and evasive. School enrollment records deepened the unease. The boy's attendance was consistent, his academic performance described as disciplined and exemplary. Teachers noted his seriousness, his tendency to speak on behalf of others, and his insistence on order. The sister, however, appeared only once, enrolled and withdrawn within the same term. The reason given was illness, though no medical documentation accompanied the note. After that, her name never appeared in any educational registry again. As these records accumulated, a pattern emerged that mirrored the tension frozen in the photograph. Authority and visibility followed the boy, while absence and erasure followed the girl. The image that had once been read as a moment of protection now aligned too closely with the historical trail, reinforcing the idea that what had been framed as care may have functioned as control. Each document seemed to echo the same quiet imbalance, suggesting that the photograph was not an exception, but a reflection of a dynamic that extended far beyond a single captured moment, reaching into a life that official history had failed to record fully. The final realization did not arrive with a single document or discovery, but through the convergence of everything that had been uncovered. The photograph, once treated as a sentimental artifact, began to resemble a deliberate construction rather than an accidental moment. Early portrait photography required stillness, cooperation, and instruction, meaning the scene had been arranged, the children positioned, and the gesture between them chosen intentionally. What now unsettled researchers was the likelihood that the pose itself was meant to communicate a message, one designed to obscure, rather than reveal the truth of their relationship. When experts revisited the cultural context of the era, they noted how often photographs were used to counter rumors or suspicion. Families under scrutiny frequently commissioned portraits to project stability and moral order, especially when questions had been raised behind closed doors. The boy's rigid composure and commanding presence aligned disturbingly well with this practice. His grip on his sister's hand, once misread as affection, now appeared symbolic, a visual assertion of possession, meant to reassure anyone who saw the image that everything was under control. The shadow that lingered at their feet took on new meaning as well. Rather than a technical anomaly, it was understood as evidence of proximity, of something standing close enough to influence the scene, but never close enough to be acknowledged. It represented the unseen pressures surrounding the family, the unspoken awareness within the community, and the quiet decision to look away. The photograph did not expose violence directly, it concealed it beneath familiarity, inviting viewers to supply their own comforting assumptions. As the sister's disappearance was reconsidered in light of this understanding, the image became the last verified record of her existence. No grave, no testimony, no official conclusion followed her absence. The photograph, then, was not simply a memory of childhood, but a boundary marker, the final moment before she passed fully out of history. The boy, by contrast, continued to exist in records, his life expanding outward while hers collapsed into silence. What ultimately redefined the photograph was the recognition that it functioned as evidence, not of innocence, but of intention. It captured a dynamic that words had failed to preserve, freezing an imbalance so normalized that it went unquestioned for generations. The longer one looked at the restored image, the clearer it became that its sweetness had always been a disguise, and that the photograph had endured not because it was harmless, but because it was effective at hiding what it truly contained.